Welcome to the AIEA video project, interviewing people who have helped to shepherd and develop international education in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years. In other words, those of us who are older are participating in this series and providing information, hopefully for archival purposes and research purposes, that will help people understand how we got to the point we are at today in international education with its recognition as being important, and how we have dealt with the ongoing challenges that continue to the present. Today I am talking with Mark W. Harris Long, who is the President Emeritus of both ELS and Perlis, two very interesting organizations that have had a long history in the trajectory of post-World War II development of international education in the United States. So it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Please call me Joan. At any rate, I would really like to talk with you a little bit about ELS and Perlis themselves, because so often in our field, we focus on the academic structures. You know how they talk about academic disciplines within universities being silos? Well, I think we also think about universities themselves as the silos of international education. But there are so many different organizations that impact the development of international education in our culture in America. And Perlis and ELS are both strong among them. So I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the mission of each of those, and then a little bit about yourself and how you started down this road.
Very well. Well, it would be a pleasure to tell you about those. And first, I would say that both Perlis and ELS were founded in the United States, and as you've correctly pointed out, they are in the for-profit sector. But they have very interesting origins. In fact, Perlis predates most of higher education in America, because it was founded in 1878 by a German immigrant who was a teacher of classic language. And he was working at Warner Polytechnic College in Providence, Rhode Island. And there were so many immigrants coming into Providence at that time, many of them European at the moment, who needed language training, that he set up a language institute to teach English to mostly very learned people who were migrating to the United States from overseas. He hired a French teacher sight unseen, based on a very impressive CV, and brought the French teacher to teach French classes whilst he was going to be in the hospital for about a week. And when the Frenchman showed up at the train station, he found out that the French teacher didn't speak English. And his first reaction was panic, because he thought, well, what's going to happen to my French class, because the teacher cannot speak anything but French. However, what happened thereafter has really reformed the learning of language learning pedagogy across the world, because the teacher proceeded to teach within French, French within French with no translation. And this became the precursor of a more formalized Perlis method, the Perlis method being a language which has no translation. So no use of the mother tongue during the classes, and at the time it was revolutionary to the extent that it was promoted at world fairs around the world and gained gold medals for its efficacy, and it was totally revolutionary. As recently as 20 or 30 years ago, many colleges and universities were still using grammar translation approach to teaching languages, whereas Perlis, that teaches all modern languages, teaches without translation, and that was the Perlis method. So Berlitz began in Providence, Rhode Island, but already by 1910, there were more than 100 Berlitz schools in about 14 countries of Europe, as well as in the Americas. So it grew very rapidly.
And does Berlitz continue to teach with this methodology today?
It teaches with a very similar methodology, which of course has been refined, and of course language itself has evolved, but we continue to teach languages mostly to adult learners. And Berlitz is still present in about 72 countries, and has about 550 learning centers across those countries.
Right.
Yeah. On the other hand, a very interesting story about the founding of ELS. The Department of State, well, let us go back to the U.S. Information Agency. U.S. Information Agency is, like the British Council, promoting U.S., or was an institution
right.
that was for the U.S. government, promoting U.S. culture, language, and education abroad. And at a certain point in the evolution of the late period with the Shah, the U.S. government determined that the Shah would be sponsoring thousands of Iranian students to come to the United States, and they would be studying in U.S. universities, and that this would be a means of creating better relations between our countries.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked 2 English language officers who had been working in the field for the U.S. Information Services to found a language program which would then be taught at university campuses in the United States. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. These 2 gentlemen, one of whom was Edwin Cornelius, who later wrote an extremely successful English text called English 100, which is now again reissued in a new edition, began a program of English for academic purposes, which was delivered on U.S. university campuses. And that is the commencement of what has become a global operation for ELS today.
Right. So your own involvement with these organizations began when and how and why?
I had attended a small liberal arts school, Oberlin College, which didn't have enough students to have their own overseas study programs. So I went with the NYU program to the University of Madrid as a sophomore in my undergraduate education. And then I went to the University of Pennsylvania and was admitted as a teaching assistant in the Romance Language Department. And in the Romance Language Department, I completed my coursework for a PhD in Latin American literature. Unfortunately, at this particular time, which was the late 1970s, the core curriculum was being abandoned, and with the core curriculum, foreign language requirements were being abandoned at U.S. universities. And my department chairman, Dr. Siebold, said, "Mark, you can continue and do your thesis, but I should warn you that you won't be able to get a job teaching language at university in this country."
Right.
One day I saw an advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper announcing people who are fluent in 2 or more languages with native fluency, and who are interested in international education, willing to be relocated domestically and abroad to join an organization with schools in 60 countries. And I went and applied for the job. I was interviewed by 4 people. All of them had been teachers in the company. And the president of the company was a Moroccan who spoke 8 languages and had started his career. His name was Rafael Alvarola. And on the train back to Philadelphia, I said, well, I can do a thesis and not get a job, or if this company offers me an opportunity to use practical language for adult education, I can take a different course and use language in a more pragmatic way, but across different learning segments.
Right.
So I did not do my thesis. I went to Berlitz, and that was 38 and a half years ago. And I've had a very exciting career, starting in a classroom and then working up through administration, being in charge of a country, being in charge of a region, doing new business development in the Far East for about a decade. And finally, in the last years, on September 11th was my first day on the job as the president and CEO of Perlis International.
Oh my goodness.
And I happened to be in Europe, and I was trapped there for about 12 days before I could get back home to the United States. But fortunately, the two schools we had within less than a half a mile of the World Trade Center, none of our employees nor any of our students were harmed or deceased from that tragedy. But it's been a long and exciting career. And one particularly from the ELS side, which has been very closely aligned with the promotion of higher education around the world.
Yes, of course. And I'm not sure that we mentioned that ELS was independent, but actually affiliated with Berlitz.
Yes, in the late 1990s, the owner, Roger Walther, who was the private owner of ELS Education Services, Inc., decided that he wished to divest as he was becoming elderly, and he wanted to reinvest the money into other things for his children.
Right.
Berlitz was given the prospectus for this company, and the then president of ELS, Perry Akins, who had been the president for nearly 21 years,
Right.
Approached me directly and said, we really want an organization with an educational organization with a similar culture to acquire ELS, because we're concerned that if we were acquired by a financial institution, that the mission and the culture of the organization would be totally changed.
Right.
So Berlitz showed interest, and we were successful over a number of other suitors who were trying to acquire ELS. ELS became part of Berlitz International in 1997.
And ELS traditionally was on college campuses.
It began on college campuses, however, the majority of the students attending, approximately 80% of the students attending ELS in the United States, were vacation study or business-related students, and about 20% of them were going on to higher ed. That changed after September 11th. As you may imagine, after September 11th, immediately parents recalled their children from the United States and asked them to come home, particularly the ones who were not yet engaged in their degree programs.
Right.
And within a matter of 3 months, 40 to 50% of all F1 students studying in English programs had gone home because their parents had recalled them.
Right.
And of course, it was a very difficult time for us. We had to downsize our faculty and our administration in proportion to the continuing low enrollments until 2003, 2004, when the numbers began to come back. In that time, you may recall that young men from predominantly Muslim countries were not allowed to have visas without a lengthy vetting process. Many of them were eventually granted F1 visas to come and study, but the first year after 9/11 and the second year after 9/11, really there were very few people coming from the Middle Eastern area, and few sponsored students from those governments at that time.
Right.
But what we did thereafter was really to become more directly involved with the recruitment of students for higher education. And more than 650 tertiary institutions recognized and recognize today the Certificate of Completion of ELS as an English language requirement. So that means if a student is applying to be admitted, they can submit their ELS certificate instead of a TOEFL score or an IELTS score. And the ELS certificate is the third most widely recognized English entrance requirement in North America today.
Right.
So we worked very closely with universities, and happily when the King Abdullah Scholarship was instituted, We already had ELS language centers operating under franchises for 15 years already in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
The Vice Minister of Education of Saudi Arabia had taken the ELS program before he went to university and got his education degree. And we were a very familiar organization to many of the people in senior government in Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
So we were blessed by many of the scholars being assigned to ELS to learn English for nearly a year before they entered into their degree programs in the United States.
Right.
And there are approximately 14 foreign governments who entrust their top scholars coming to U.S. higher ed to ELS, including the fact that we are the only for-profit organization in the world that the Bolshak Scholarship of Kazakhstan will entrust their students to.
Right.
Otherwise, it must be a very short list of academic institutions who are all not-for-profits.
So your work is really interesting for a number of reasons, and I think one is that you have multiple constituencies, and certainly some of those constituencies really directly interact with universities, with American universities.
Yes, of course, many of the universities where we're located are large, well-known public institutions.
Right.
And they have chosen to partner with ELS for ELS to deliver intensive English on the campus of the university. And we basically undertake all of the process, the student support, the housing. The F1 visa is issued by ELS. The documentation for the visa is issued by ELS, not by the university. And the students come and study 6 hours a day, 5 days a week in 4-week sessions. Our curriculum in English consists of 1,240 contact hours in classes of an average of 8 students.
Right.
It's extremely intense. And most students, realistically, let's say a student from China would typically be in our 4th level, but that means that they're going to have 800 or 900 hours of training with ELS, during which they'll learn study skills, they'll learn the classroom etiquette, they'll do advanced writing and research, attribution of sources, and they'll learn the rules of plagiarism and citation of sources and classroom participation and the skills that will probably be more challenging than just language when they get into their university studies. And that's our role in assisting those students to have academic success once they enter.
It sounds like the ELS side is very closely tied to universities. What about the Perlis side?
The Perlis side is, I would say, more allied with profit-making institutions. A lot of our students in the Perlis side are recognized people. Just to name a few, Jimmy Carter, when he became governor of the state of Georgia, realized that there were many Hispanic people in the state. He felt it was his moral obligation to attempt to learn their language, and he studied Spanish with us. And I'm happy to say that in his advancing years, he's been very active in Habitat for Humanity in Latin America, where he uses his Spanish continuously. Such people as Giscard d'Estaing, Sarkozy, Berlusconi, these people all studied languages with Berlitz. Tsar Nicholas II invited Berlitz to establish a school in the St. Petersburg Summer Palace when he was Tsar, because he wanted to learn French so that he could help to bring closer ties between Russia, which was somewhat isolated at that time, open it up and be more friendly with France. There were 13 Berlitz schools in Russia at the time the revolution began. The schools all disappeared by the end of the war, but we have letters of school directors saying first that the students would come and stay in the school and study for long hours, because there was heat in the school
Mhm.
and they couldn't afford to heat their homes or couldn't
Yeah.
get. And then at a later date, the Red Army came and they came in and they took the furniture to heat the soldiers. So they
Yeah.
took all the furniture out and broke it up and burned it in the camps. There were many things that.
So Perlis has had a history tied to the changes and waves.
And politics and
yeah.
the wars. We have pictures of people going off to the First World War, marching in front of the Berlitz schools in Austria.
Right.
One of our teachers was James Joyce. James Joyce worked in Trieste.
Really?
Trieste, and then again worked for Berlitz in Dublin.
Wow.
When we were in Dublin. I personally, as a center director, signed up people like Olivia Hussey. Pele came
Yeah.
to Berlitz in 3 different locations.
So this is a form, it's another form, it's a public adult education
Yes.
form of international education.
Yes, and many times adult learners, for obvious purposes, they need flexibility of schedule and
Right.
they need privacy. Many royal families have employed Berlitz to teach, and of course, often they don't want to, make it known that
Right.
they're learning, because there may be some private reasons why they're
Right.
doing that. We have a very, very impressive list. One of the people who always speaks up, we were fortunate, Meryl Streep was one of the very excellent students who studied with us. Robin Williams studied with us. One person who always cites, whenever people ask how she learned English, she always says Berlitz, is Celine Dion.
Oh.
And Celine Dion was a chanson, she sang in French, but she had never learned English well enough to sing in English.
Right.
And she went to one of the Berlitz school, we have 4 in Montreal, and she learned English, and then she began making albums in English.
Right.
We tend to have people from government often,
Right.
from sports. Beckenbauer is another footballista. We had Ronaldinho. I mean, we have a really illustrious list of them,
Right.
because they move, and we've got Berlitz schools all around. So if they
Right.
change teams, they end up in another city.
Right.
If it's London, that's fine. If it's Barcelona, there's 3 Berlitz schools in
Right.
Barcelona, and we
Right.
can accommodate them.
Right.
Entertainers, people in the arts often come to Berlitz
Right.
for training, and then just in the first years, it was really people who had occasion to travel,
Mhm.
and travel was very different, of course, in the early 1900s, but also the attitudes towards education and the importance of language. Everyone studied, Latin.
Right.
Or Greek and Latin, and then an educated person would probably study French, Spanish, or German as
Right.
well. So this was the foundation of Berlitz, and continues to be a motivating factor today.
So it's so interesting that it's a famous constituency, and I'm sure a public constituency that wants to learn languages. What is the motivation today for adult learners taking Berlitz courses?
Same thing. I mean, a lot of entertainers is to go from being local to being
Okay.
international.
Do you get a general constituency of individuals who are not?
Yeah, we have small group programs which are, tuitions are not so expensive, and beginners courses for people who are rather, never did it during university because they were too consumed with their other subjects, and then they decided that really
It'd be fun to come
wanted
and learn
yes.
French or Spanish.
Or people who are getting married. For example, Olivia Hussey came to learn Japanese because she had just married a Japanese pop singer by the
Right.
name of Akira Fusei.
Mhm.
Akira Fusei studied English with Berlitz in Japan,
You're
English,
international
and she studied
matchmakers.
Japanese.
Yeah.
Wolfgang Puck's designer who designed his first Spago,
Right.
almost immediately got a commission to work in Japan
Right.
on a extension of Spago in Japan. And she wanted to learn some Japanese, and she came to Berlitz and she learned some Japanese.
Do you ever have American undergraduates who do Berlitz courses?
Well, we do some tutoring, yes, and we've done some work through, language clubs, even including at the University of Chicago and Harvard, where students said, we can't take a course in this language at our school, or we can't schedule it. So, but we want to learn. So, can you give us Mandarin lessons with a native speaker, a
Right.
native fluent speaker
Right.
of Mandarin? after hours,
Right.
or on Saturdays, or on
Right.
Sundays, and we would do that. But getting back to the question about whether or not Berlitz is involved with university programs, we have many university programs through Berlitz as well, because typically outside of the United States, universities are trying to improve the efficacy of their English instruction.
Right.
And sometimes they come to ELS, sometimes they go to Berlitz, but Berlitz is often more familiar to them in
Right.
countries where ELS is not present. So, for example, in Mexico, there's a very large for-profit university called Unitec.
Yes.
And Unitec had in the Distrito Federal, they had 3 major campuses. At one time, Berlitz was simultaneously training almost 20,000 people and 20,000 students in English for Unitec.
Mm-hmm.
In Japan, there's a university which is the most applied to private university in Japan, and that university has created a global faculty of languages, and the English in Japan is taught with ELS curriculum, and the students then come to US universities for one entire academic year,
Mm-hmm.
and ELS teaches them here on the US campuses. There are 500 students a year coming just in that program,
Right.
and they're going to 20 different US campuses
Right.
where ELS is present, and those who have high enough English level are then able to enter into credit-bearing courses for the spring semester. But during the fall semester, they're all full-time, 6 hours a day English classes.
Yes.
And when they return, then they can do business English at their campus with Berlitz in Japan,
Right.
or they can pursue additional studies either in Mandarin or in Korea and do a study abroad in Korea or China after they've gotten back to Japan and done a semester. So, those are just examples. We have the Naval Academy in Chile. There's several private universities in Chile. University of Los Andes in Colombia, where they're also studying English curriculum. The ELS curriculum is being used at a very large university in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And thousands of students are getting taught with our method and our materials.
Mm-hmm.
So, both institutions, depending on what the objective of the training is.
That's a very interesting niche within the whole international education spectrum that's being played by for-profit institutions, and they are making a real contribution.
Yes, most certainly. And as you said, a niche, and just turning a little bit towards U.S. higher education. Often, U.S. higher education has been in a receiving mode, particularly with regards to postgraduate studies. I mean, we were the only, other than the UK or perhaps Australia, within the English-speaking world, mind you,
Right.
were magnets to people who wanted to learn STEMs
Right.
and wanted to do high-level scientific research. So foreign governments were very eager to send those people to the United States, and there have been sponsorship programs. Many of the scholarship programs have been driven by politics,
Mm-hmm.
as was this founding wave of ELSers in 60, 61, 62,
Mhm.
63. But the same thing is true. I mean, when the Vietnam War was underway, there were enormous programs. MUSIA, the Midwest Consortium here in the United States, established some branch campuses in Malaysia, and then the Malaysian government sponsored first undergraduate students to come to the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and then after a 4-year period, they transitioned to sponsoring only postgraduates.
Mm-hmm.
This was a time when we were very eager that Indonesia and Malaysia not go too far to the left,
Right.
and there were signs that they might. So the U.S. government encouraged these programs of educational exchange and did some sponsorship. And tens of thousands of Malaysians and tens of thousands of Indonesians came to the United States for higher education during and after more towards after the end of the Vietnam War.
Right.
So today, nevertheless, there are developing markets, and in 2003, ELS went to Vietnam and did a joint venture with Roger Williams College from Bristol, Connecticut, and a tertiary institution in Vietnam, and ELS. And we did a tripartite program and began offering English for students who were going to enter into a U.S. accredited degree program. And after 2 years would then transfer to the United States and continue their education in various schools in the United States. We were able to do that because with the know-how and the agility that Perlis has throughout the developed world and developing world, it was not a complicated thing for us to posit how to establish ourselves there and to get recognized by the government of Vietnam to open that school. We then subsequently, when the U.S. government was trying to promote higher education to support some of the U.S. investments by Microsoft and others in Vietnam as a place of production of chips and so forth, then the U.S. Embassy began partnering with the Ministry of Higher Education in Vietnam to have education conferences. And who did they come to for sponsorship? ELS.
Right.
So we were one of the primary sponsors for the first 3 years that those conferences took place in Hanoi, and we were there. When the China market started heating up and more visas were being issued, and these were not sponsored students from the Chinese government, but rather self-paid, private citizens, in 2006, 2007, 2008, ELS organized the first ever U.S. pavilion at the Beijing Education Fair. And we sponsored 26 U.S. universities and actually paid for their participation in that event, which attracted 30 or 40,000 students in the course of 2 days.
Wow.
Study USA is continuously promoting U.S. higher education through a series of educational events. Almost anywhere they are in Southeast or East Asia, whether it's Taiwan or whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Cambodia, whether it's even Burma, ELS is always there, and we're giving support to those activities. Not because we're necessarily directly going to benefit from it, but we need to assist U.S. universities making their programs available and visible to those markets.
Right.
And then the universities are responsible to determine how they can make their education affordable. And of course, many of these countries, they need to provide some kind of financial aid, because it's inconceivable for the average person in Burma or even in Vietnam to be able to come and pay.
Right.
80% of all Vietnamese students studying in the United States study in community colleges.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because they've got relations here, and they go and they live with their relations, and they go to the nearest community college for a very accessible tuition.
Right.
So we've
So
taken...
you're really serving all these different constituencies that are not necessarily traditionally served in the institutional structure.
I think what happens is that we can fill the absence of leadership and continuous presence in these markets. When we established a campus in Shanghai in 2008, and we are the only U.S. accredited English program operating in China. We went there to kind of, put a stake in the ground, and we established a platform for U.S. higher education institutions when they're doing recruitment, and said, when you come to China, we recommend you come here, because this was a city where foreigners were allowed to meet Chinese historically. So there's a spiritual connection there. And we're going to be here in the French concession, former French concession here in Shanghai. And we have a theater auditorium. We've got a campus with classrooms, and we're teaching people English. And you come here and we will promote your institution. You tell us when you're coming, send some materials, or we'll print them for you in China, and we will announce through social media and through emailing and through the U.S. Commercial services that you're coming, and we'll hold a big event. When the Shanghai Expo took place, ELS, American Education Center in Shanghai, hosted the press conference of the governor of Hawaii, who was coming and really thought that this was a great opportunity. The expo she was going to visit, Hawaii receives a tremendous amount of tourism from China, and she went there and held a press conference, and that's exactly the kind of event that we would hold. Several standing committees of the American Chamber of Commerce have their monthly meetings in the ELS, American Education Center, and the TESOL, there's a chapter of the Teachers of English as a Second Language in China, and they hold their annual meeting at the ELS Center and spend 2 days there talking about pedagogy and having workshops and so forth. So these are things that we can do to support the entire ecosystem, because there's a whole ecosystem. There are educational counselors, there are English medium high schools, there are test prep organizations, there are counseling agencies who actually help people do the paperwork and assemble their university applications and so forth. We create information systems that allow counselors to be more effective in their counseling. And the agents who are working with ELS have access to a database that has hundreds of US universities, and they can search any major, they can search by band in terms of tuition, they can search by ranking, they can search by city, state, and so forth. And we have people in country who in local language can answer questions about those institutions 7x24. So we've got a good delivery on higher educational information, which is very different from the excellent work done by the U.S. Consular Services. U.S. Consular Services has a library in these cities with public access, so students can come into it, but they're enjoined from recommending a university. And what we can do is they can come in and they can ask us and say, well, this is my GPA.
Where would I be
and this is the major I want. This is the state where my uncle lives. Which schools should be in my decision set? And then we can advise them. Now, we are not going to prepare their documents because they have to get a bank statement, they have to get a recommendation letter, but we will help them make that decision process using our database and using the information available to us. And if there's any questions, we can refer it back to our offices here in the United States and get them accurate answers for every aspect of admission for the program that they've chosen.
Well, certainly, especially talking about China, with the influx of Chinese students to the United States, those services become very important. And that really leads me to a couple of final questions. And one is, you're describing where your organizations have come and their contribution, and you're describing how you fit within the whole field of international education. Where are we today? And how are you concerned about changes? Are you concerned about the impact of politics on all of this? Are you hopeful? Are you dismayed?
Well, the short answer would be recently I've been quite dismayed. And recently, there's been, as a matter of fact, there's a dark cloud. The last time I was in Manhattan, I looked over and tried to see if I could see the Statue of Liberty, and I wasn't sure that the torch was still lit. But we international educators have a mission, and our mission is to create a better world through education. And creating a better world through education means getting people together. And I mean, literally getting them together. I mean, getting them in contact with each other is good, but, I saw a little cartoon, that somebody sent me the other day with, four people of very different origin, and it said, you know, one of these people is a Christian, one of them is Jewish, one of them is a practicer of Islam, and the other one's an atheist. And it was like a joke. And it said,
Yeah.
these people went into a coffee shop and sat down at the same table and started drinking coffee. And pretty soon they started laughing, and then pretty soon and then they all walked out of the cafe friends.
Yeah.
The point was, you get people together, they understand what they have in common, rather than worry about what they see as being different.
Right.
And international education is about that. It's to educate people about the fact that wherever we came from, and what I can say is 98% of the population in this country are descendants of people who did not inhabit this continent even 250 years ago.
Right.
So we're all immigrants.
Right.
So when should we decide that we are going to slam the door in somebody's face?
Right.
Higher education has to keep that door open. We have to advocate. We understand the outcome of international education as being one of peace,
Mm-hmm.
just in the same sense that when there's a graduation ceremony for 2,000 Saudi students who are paid full fare to attend US universities because King Abdullah sees the next generation economy in Saudi Arabia not being based on resources
Right.
other than human.
Right.
He wants information technology to run the next. So when those people are graduating and ELS is asked to go up and accept an award for having taught these people English, and the vice minister says, congratulations to the graduates, and by the way, I studied at ELS in 1973. And then the other person behind him, who's also from the Ministry of Education, says, me too.
Yeah.
Those people are friends of the United States of America.
Yeah.
So we have to keep the door open, and we have to keep making friends.
Right.
We don't need to make enemies.
Right.
There are plenty of enemies in the world, and enemies not because they have anything specific why to be our enemies, but because we don't understand them and they don't understand us. If we can get together, we will understand each other, and we will be friends, like those four people who went into the coffee shop.
Well, that's a perfect note to end this discussion on, because it's a note of optimism in a time when many people feel stress. This has been most interesting to me. I think I mentioned to you that I used to work with AIFS, which used to be affiliated with ELS. So it's really exciting for me to hear you tell the history and the development and the tale of these organizations that you're telling their story. You're being a storyteller, just like people listening to language listen to stories. And it's very insightful, because it's an area we don't always think about when we talk about international education, and it's clearly an area of influence. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.